She called me dead weight and kicked me out of the house in front of her parents. I stayed quiet. When her father said he'd known me since childhood, she called me freeloader and kicked me out of the house in front of her parents. I stayed quiet. When her father said he'd known me since childhood, she found out who I really was. I never thought I'd be thrown out of a home like garbage, especially not by the woman I'd devoted 5 years of my life to. But there I stood on the perfectly manicured lawn of Eleanor's parents' colonial mansion, the echoes of her words still ringing in my ears. "You're nothing but dead weight, Oliver. Dead weight." The evening had started pleasantly enough. Eleanor's parents had invited us for Thanksgiving dinner, a formal affair with crystal glasses, polished silver, and conversation that always circled back to status and achievement. I'd grown accustomed to these dinners over the years, learning to navigate the subtle undercurrents of judgment that flowed beneath the polite conversation. "So, Oliver," Eleanor's mother Judith had asked while delicately cutting her turkey, "any progress on finding a better position yet?" I'd smiled tightly, the same smile I'd perfected over years of these questions. "My work at the community center is going well. We just received a grant to expand our after-school program." The silence that followed was thick with disappointment. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably beside me, her shoulders tensing as she always did when her family's expectations and her husband's reality collided. "How commendable," Judith replied, her tone making it clear that commendable was not a compliment in her vocabulary. Eleanor's father, Richard, had remained silent, studying his wineglass with unusual intensity. I'd always felt he was different from the rest of them, quieter, more thoughtful, but he never contradicted his wife or daughter. The breaking point came when Eleanor's brother Malcolm asked about our plans to buy a house. "We're still saving," I explained, "with Eleanor's medical school loans and—" "What Oliver means," Eleanor interrupted, her voice sharp, "is that he can't afford to provide a proper home. I'm the one carrying us financially while trying to build my career." I stared at her, stunned. We'd had this argument in private, but she'd never thrown me to the wolves like this. "Eleanor," I said quietly, "you know that's not fair." Her eyes flashed with something I'd never seen before, not just anger, but contempt. "Fair? You want to talk about fair?" She stood up, wine sloshing in her glass. "I'm killing myself at the hospital while you play social worker for minimum wage. I thought you had potential, Oliver. I thought you would grow, advance, become someone. Instead, you're dragging me down, perfectly content to let me do all the heavy lifting while you chase your noble causes." The dining room fell silent. Judith looked smugly vindicated, Malcolm embarrassed, and Richard looked strangely pained. "I've supported your dreams from day one," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I've worked 3 jobs so you could focus on your studies. And now I'm a doctor, and what are you? Still the same Oliver, with the same modest ambitions and the same pathetic salary." Eleanor's voice rose with each word. "I'm tired of carrying dead weight. I've outgrown you." The words hit like physical blows. 5 years of loving her, supporting her, believing in us, reduced to dead weight. "I think you should leave," she continued, her voice ice cold. "We both know this isn't working anymore." I looked around the table, at these people I'd broken bread with for years, hoping someone would speak up. No one did. As I stood, legs unsteady, Richard finally looked at me directly. Something in his eyes, recognition, regret, made me pause. But he said nothing as I walked out. The door slammed behind me with devastating finality. I stood on the lawn, the November air biting through my thin sweater. The one Eleanor had always complained was too shabby for family gatherings. Inside, through the bay window, I could see them resume their meal, adjusting to my absence like I'd never been there at all. Except for Richard, who sat staring at my empty chair, a strange expression on his face that I couldn't quite decipher. I turned away and started walking, with no destination in mind, and the crushing realization that the life I thought I was building had just crumbled beneath my feet. The woman I loved saw me as nothing but a burden. And the worst part, as tears blurred my vision and the cold wind numbed my face, I wondered if she might be right. The small apartment felt colder than usual as I turned the key in the lock. One bedroom, a kitchenette and a living room barely big enough for the second-hand sofa I'd found at a yard sale. Eleanor had refused to live here, preferring to stay in her parents' guest house while completing her residency. Temporary, she'd called it. Now I understood it had always been more than that, a physical manifestation of the distance growing between us. I collapsed onto the sofa, still wearing my coat, the events of the evening replaying in my mind like a horror film I couldn't turn off. 5 years together, erased in a single evening. Dead weight. The words echoed, finding all my hidden insecurities and amplifying them. My phone buzzed. Taylor, my friend from the community center. "How'd the fancy dinner go?" his text read. I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking. How could I possibly explain? I finally typed, "Not great. Talk tomorrow." I set the phone down and looked around the apartment. Evidence of my triple life was everywhere. Case files from the community center, lesson plans for the night classes I taught at the adult education center, invoices from the handyman jobs I picked up on weekends. 3 jobs, stretched between every waking hour. And still Eleanor saw me as someone without ambition. The irony wasn't lost on me. While she'd studied, I'd paid our rent. While she'd interned, I'd covered the utilities. While she'd networked with future colleagues, I'd skipped meals to make sure her car insurance never lapsed. All so she could become the doctor she'd dreamed of being. I'd been proud to support her, happy to be the foundation she could build upon. I never expected gratitude, that wasn't why I did it, but I never expected contempt either. I dragged myself to the bathroom, avoiding my reflection as I splashed cold water on my face. The medicine cabinet hung slightly open, revealing the orange prescription bottle tucked in the corner. The depression had started about 2 years ago, when the strain of multiple jobs began taking its toll. I'd hidden it from Eleanor. She had enough pressure without worrying about my mental health. Another sacrifice in a long line of them. The bedside clock read 11:36 p.m. when I finally lay down, exhaustion pulling at me, but sleep remaining elusive. Tomorrow was Friday. Community center until 5, night class until 9, then an early morning repair job for Mrs. Geller, whose kitchen sink had been leaking for weeks. I'd have to reschedule all of it. The thought of facing people, of explaining what had happened, was unbearable. When sleep finally came, it was fitful and filled with dreams of Eleanor's face, twisted with disgust as she labeled me dead weight, burden, failure. Morning arrived, with cruel brightness. For a moment, in the hazy space between sleep and wakefulness, everything was normal. Then reality crashed back. The dinner, Eleanor's words, the silent condemnation of her family. My phone showed 8 missed calls and a dozen texts, all from Taylor and my sister Maggie. Nothing from Eleanor. I wasn't surprised, but the absence still stung. I forced myself out of bed and made coffee, going through the motions while my mind raced. What now? The life I'd carefully constructed had been built around supporting Eleanor, adjusting my schedule to accommodate hers, planning for a future together. Without that purpose, what was left? Maggie called again as I was pouring my second cup. "Oliver, what's going on? Taylor called me, said you weren't answering and he's worried." I swallowed hard. "Eleanor and I are done. She ended things last night." A pause. "I'm coming over." "No, Mags, you're 3 hours away and you have work." "I'm coming over," she repeated firmly. "You've always been there for me. Let me be there for you." After she hung up, I sat at my small kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills. Most were in both our names. Would Eleanor even bother to pay her share now? I'd have to pick up more handyman jobs, maybe look for full-time work that paid better than the community center. A knock at the door startled me out of my calculations. It was barely 9 a.m. Maggie couldn't have made it from Portsmouth yet. When I opened the door, Richard Caldwell stood in my hallway, looking distinctly out of place in his tailored coat and polished shoes. Eleanor's father shifted uncomfortably, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something almost apologetic. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice gentler than I'd ever heard it. Confusion and a flicker of anger warred within me. Where was this concern when his daughter was tearing me apart? Nevertheless, I stepped aside. Richard entered slowly, taking in my modest apartment with none of the judgment I'd come to expect from the Caldwells. He stopped at the small bookshelf where a framed photo sat, my grandparents in front of the old family farmhouse, taken the summer before they passed. His hand reached toward it, then stopped, hovering in mid-air. Something in his expression shifted, recognition, then what appeared to be genuine sadness. "I should have spoken up last night," he finally said, turning to face me. "What Eleanor did, how she spoke to you, it was unforgivable." I stared at him, this man who had sat silently through years of subtle digs and finally through my public humiliation. Why was he here now? "With all due respect, sir," I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice, "it's a little late for that." Richard nodded, his eyes returning to my grandparents' photo. "There's something you should know, Oliver. Something I've kept to myself for far too long." Another knock interrupted us. Taylor, his face concerned. Behind him, through the window, I could see Mrs. Geller peering anxiously from her doorway. My world had shattered, but life demanded I keep moving forward. And for the first time in years, I had no idea how to do that. I managed to convince Taylor I was okay, a lie he accepted only reluctantly, and asked him to reschedule my appointments at the community center. Mrs. Geller agreed to wait until Monday for her sink repair. When they left, Richard was still standing by my bookshelf studying my grandparents' photo with an intensity that made me uneasy. "You wanted to tell me something," I prompted, gesturing toward my small kitchen table. Richard sat down heavily, suddenly looking every bit his 65 years. "I recognized your grandfather the moment I saw this picture," he said, nodding toward the photo. "Thomas Reeves." I stared at him, confused. "You knew my grandfather?" A sad smile crossed his face. "I more than knew him, Oliver. I worked for him for almost 15 years. The statement didn't make sense. My grandfather had been a farmer with a modest property outside Millfield. He died when I was 10, leaving the farm to my father, who sold it to pay medical bills. "There must be some mistake," I said. "My grandfather was a farmer." Richard shook his head. "That was just one of Thomas's interests. Your grandfather owned Reeves Enterprises before he sold it to focus on his philanthropic work." I gripped the edge of the table. Reeves Enterprises was one of the largest private companies in the state before being acquired by a conglomerate in the early 2000s. There was no way. "That's impossible," I said. "We were never wealthy. My dad was a high school teacher. When Grandpa died, the farm was all he left." Richard reached into his coat and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Reeves donates millions to Children's Hospital." Beneath it was a photo of my grandfather, younger than I'd ever seen him, standing beside a building bearing his name. "Your grandfather was one of the wealthiest men in the state," Richard said quietly, "but he was also one of the most private. He believed wealth should be used for service, not status. When he sold the company, he put most of the proceeds into a foundation that still funds dozens of community projects anonymously." My head swam. "But we lived simply. Dad never mentioned any of this." "That was Thomas's philosophy. He raised your father to value work and contribution over wealth and privilege. From what I understand, your father chose to maintain that tradition." I suddenly remembered childhood conversations with Dad about the importance of giving back, of using our talents to help others rather than accumulate things. Was this what had shaped those values? "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, struggling to process this revelation. Richard sighed deeply. "When I first met you 5 years ago, I recognized your name, but wasn't certain of the connection. Then I saw how you lived, how you worked multiple jobs to support Eleanor's dreams without complaint. It reminded me so much of Thomas's quiet generosity." He looked down at his hands. "I should have said something last night when Eleanor spoke to you that way. The truth is, I was ashamed that my daughter could treat someone with such disrespect, especially someone from a family that has done so much good without seeking recognition or thanks." My mind raced. "Does Eleanor know any of this?" "No," Richard shook his head. "The Reeves family kept their philanthropy anonymous, and I've respected that privacy. Thomas was my mentor, Oliver. He gave me my start when no one else would take a chance on me. Everything I've achieved I owe to him." The irony was almost too much to bear. All this time, Eleanor and her mother had looked down on me, believing I lacked ambition or pedigree, while her father knew I came from a family that had quietly shaped the very community they lived in. "There's more," Richard continued, his voice lower. "The foundation your grandfather established still exists. As his grandson, you have a seat on the board if you want it. You also have access to funds earmarked for continuing education for family members." I stared at him, stunned. Why didn't anyone tell me this before? Your father was very committed to Thomas's philosophy that each generation should make its own way, find its own purpose. He wanted you to develop your own values without the influence of family wealth. Richard paused. "But I think given current circumstances, he would want you to know the truth now." The room fell silent as I tried to absorb everything. My entire understanding of my family history had just been upended. The modest upbringing I'd always known had been a deliberate choice, not a limitation. "Oliver," Richard said gently, "I know this is overwhelming, and it doesn't erase the hurt Eleanor caused, but I want you to know that your grandfather would be proud of the man you've become. You've honored his legacy without even knowing it existed." A strange calm settled over me. All these years, I'd measured myself by Eleanor's standards and found myself lacking. But I'd been living according to values passed down through generations, values I'd absorbed without even knowing their origin. "What happens now?" I asked, more to myself than to Richard. He stood up, straightening his coat. "That's entirely up to you. But whatever you decide, I want you to know you have my support and respect." As Richard headed toward the door, he turned back. "Eleanor doesn't know I'm here. She's convinced herself she was justified last night, but she'll learn the truth soon enough." After he left, I sat at my table for a long time, staring at the newspaper clipping he'd left behind. The man in the photo, my grandfather, looked back at me with the same quiet determination I saw in my own eyes every morning. For the first time since being thrown out of the Caldwell's home, I felt something other than despair. Not quite hope yet, but perhaps something even more valuable: clarity. The week after Richard's visit passed in a blur. I took a few days off from the community center, using sick days I'd accumulated over years. Maggie stayed with me for the weekend, her steady presence an anchor in the storm. I shared Richard's revelation with her, watching her eyes widen in disbelief. "That explains so much about Dad," she said, shaking her head. "Remember how he always insisted we volunteer? How he turned down that principal position because he said he was needed more as a teacher?" I nodded, memories flooding back. Dad refusing to buy a new car even when he could afford it, instead donating to the school's scholarship fund. The extra hours he spent tutoring kids who couldn't pay. Mum's quiet support of his choices, never complaining about our modest lifestyle. "I always thought we were just getting by," I said. "But they were making deliberate choices." On Monday morning, I received an email from an attorney representing the Reeves Foundation, requesting a meeting. With a mix of curiosity and apprehension, I agreed. The foundation offices were located in a plain brick building downtown. Nothing ostentatious, just quiet efficiency. The attorney, Ms. Winters, was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who nodded briskly when I entered her office. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "I've been waiting a long time to have this conversation." She explained that upon my grandfather's death, certain assets had been placed in trust for his grandchildren to be accessed once we reached 35 or in the event of significant life changes. Apparently, Richard Caldwell's call to the foundation had triggered the latter condition. "Your grandfather believed deeply in education, service, and quiet dignity," Ms. Winters said, sliding a folder across her desk. "This contains everything you need to know about your inheritance and your position on the foundation board, should you choose to accept it." I opened the folder, then almost dropped it when I saw the figures. The trust wasn't just a modest sum, it represented generational wealth carefully managed and grown over decades. "This can't be right," I whispered. Ms. Winters smiled, the first crack in her professional demeanor. "Thomas was an excellent investor and an even better human being. He wanted his family to have the resources to do meaningful work without financial worry, but he also wanted you to develop the character to handle such resources wisely." She continued, "The foundation operates quite differently from most. We don't put names on buildings or issue press releases. We identify community needs and address them without fanfare. Your grandfather believed true charity doesn't seek recognition. I thought about the community center where I worked, which had received a mysterious grant last year that saved our after-school program. Was the Reeves Foundation behind the West Side Initiative grant? Ms. Winters nodded. One of many. We've been watching your work there, Oliver. It's precisely the kind of impact your grandfather valued. As I walked out of the office an hour later, my head spinning with information, my phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "We need to talk, please." I stared at the message, feeling oddly detached. A week ago, those words would have sent hope surging through me. Now they barely registered. Instead, I called Taylor and told him I'd be back at the center tomorrow. The kids in our program didn't care about family legacies or trust funds. They just needed someone who showed up for them consistently. That, at least, hadn't changed. By Thursday, word had spread through Eleanor's family circle that something significant had occurred. I received a voicemail from Judith. Her tone drastically changed from the condescension I'd grown accustomed to. "Oliver, dear, we've been so worried about you. Please call us when you can." I deleted it without calling back. Eleanor's texts grew increasingly urgent. "Oliver, my father told me some things I didn't know. Please let me explain." And later, "I made a terrible mistake. Can we please talk?" Finally, I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop, neutral territory. When I arrived, she was already there, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. Her normally perfect hair was pulled back hastily, and she wore no makeup. She stood when she saw me, uncertainty replacing her usual confidence. "Oliver," she said, her voice catching, "thank you for coming." I sat down across from her, maintaining an emotional distance that would have been impossible just days earlier. "What did you want to talk about?" She took a deep breath. "My father told me about your grandfather, about the foundation." Her eyes searched mine. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "I didn't know," I said simply. "Dad never mentioned it. I learned about it the same time you did." Disbelief flashed across her face. "But how could you not know your family was important?" I finished for her. "My family has always been important, Eleanor, just not in the ways you value." She flinched at that. "I deserved that," she said quietly. "What I said at dinner. It was unforgivable." I studied her, this woman I had loved enough to sacrifice everything for. "Why did you say it?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I was frustrated. The pressure at the hospital is intense, and my mother keeps comparing me to colleagues who are advancing faster. When you mentioned we were still saving for a house, I just snapped." "You humiliated me in front of your family," I said, the pain still fresh. "You called me dead weight after I worked 3 jobs to put you through medical school." "I know," she whispered. "I've been selfish and blind. But now that I understand about your family, about the foundation—" I held up my hand, stopping her. "That's exactly the problem, Eleanor. You're only here because you found out I'm a Reeves. If I were still just Oliver, the community center coordinator, we wouldn't be having this conversation." She paled. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" I asked gently. "Tell me honestly, if nothing had changed except that I'd forgiven you for that night, would you be satisfied with my career, my goals, my values?" Her silence was answer enough. "I loved you enough to support you becoming who you wanted to be," I continued, "but you never offered me the same acceptance. You were always trying to change me into someone who would impress your family." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I didn't see what was right in front of me," she admitted. "The man who worked himself to exhaustion so I could follow my dreams." I felt a wave of sadness, not for what I'd lost, but for what had never really existed between us. "The money and the foundation don't change who I am, Eleanor. I'm still the same person with the same values. If that wasn't enough for you before, it won't be enough now." "What if I've changed?" she asked, reaching for my hand across the table. "What if I finally see you clearly?" I gently withdrew my hand. "I'm glad if this has helped you recognize what matters, but I deserve someone who values me for exactly who I am, not for my family name or bank account." As I stood to leave, Eleanor looked up at me, a dawning realization in her eyes. "You're not coming back, are you?" For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt completely certain. "No," I said quietly. "I'm moving forward." Outside, the crisp December air filled my lungs as I walked away from the coffee shop. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of expectation lifting from my shoulders. Whatever came next would be on my terms, honoring my grandfather's legacy while creating my own. By mid-January, news of my connection to the Reeves family had spread through Eleanor's social circle like wildfire. I received invitations to charity galas I'd previously been deemed unsuitable for, LinkedIn connection requests from Eleanor's colleagues who had once barely acknowledged me, and even a Christmas card from Judith with a handwritten note expressing how she had always admired my humble spirit. I filed them all away, focusing instead on the opportunities before me. After careful consideration, I had accepted the board position at the foundation, working closely with Ms. Winters to understand the scope of my grandfather's legacy. I continued my job at the community center, but reduced my other work, using the newfound time to develop a proposal for expanding our youth programs. It was during a planning meeting at the center that I received a text from Maggie. "Eleanor's outside in the parking lot. Has been for 20 minutes. I excused myself and found Eleanor leaning against her car, a far cry from the confident surgeon who had dismissed me 2 months earlier. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usual perfect posture was replaced by a defeated slump. "I wanted to drop this off," she said, holding out a box. "Your things from my parents' house." I took it, noting the carefully wrapped frame peeking from the top, a photo of us in better days. "You could have mailed it. I wanted to see you." Her voice was small. "I miss you, Oliver." A chill wind swept through the parking lot, but I barely felt it. 2 months ago, those words would have been everything I wanted to hear. Now, they stirred only a dull ache. "Eleanor, please," she interrupted. "Just hear me out. I've been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of therapy, actually." She wrapped her arms around herself. "What I did was cruel and unforgivable. I let my insecurities and my mother's expectations warp me into someone I don't want to be." I studied her face, searching for the manipulation I'd expected, but finding only raw honesty. "I appreciate you saying that. I'm not here because of your family name or the foundation," she continued hastily. "I didn't even tell my mother I was coming. I realized what I threw away. Not the Oliver Reeves with connections, but the man who held my hand through every medical school panic attack, who quizzed me on anatomy terms at 2 a.m., who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Her vulnerability caught me off guard. This wasn't the rehearsed apology I'd imagined. "I've changed," she said when I didn't respond. "Or maybe I'm finding my way back to who I was before I let status and expectations consume me. Either way, I know I don't deserve another chance. But I had to tell you that I see you now. Really see you. And I'm sorry it took losing you to realize what was right in front of me all along." "Eleanor," I said gently, "I believe you're sincere. But I'm not sure it's enough." Pain flashed across her face. "I understand. She stopped, composing herself. "I've left the practice at my mother's country club. I'm working at the county hospital now, in their underserved communities program. It's where I'm needed most." That surprised me. Eleanor had fought hard for that prestigious private practice position. "That's a significant change." She nodded. "It's something I should have done long ago. The work is harder, the hours are longer, but for the first time since residency, I feel like I'm making a real difference." We stood in silence for a moment, the gap between us filled with unspoken words. "Would you—" She hesitated. "Would you consider having dinner sometime? Just to talk, as friends if nothing else?" I considered the request. Despite everything, I couldn't deny there was still a connection between us, a history that couldn't be erased by one terrible night. "I'm not ready for that," I admitted. "Maybe someday, but not yet." She nodded, accepting this with a quiet dignity I hadn't expected. "I understand. But if you ever change your mind—" She reached into her pocket and handed me a business card with her new hospital information. "I'm not going anywhere." As she turned to leave, something compelled me to speak. "Eleanor?" She looked back, hope flickering in her eyes. "I'm proud of you," I said, "for making these changes for yourself, not for me or your parents." The smile she gave me was tinged with sadness, but also with something like peace. "I learned that from you, Oliver. You were always true to yourself, even when it cost you everything." After she drove away, I stood in the parking lot for a long time, the box of memories in my arms. Part of me wanted to believe her transformation was genuine and lasting. Another part remembered the sting of her contempt, the ease with which she'd discarded me when I no longer fit her vision of success. Later that evening, as I sorted through the box, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Oliver Reeves," a woman's voice asked when I answered. "Yes, this is Oliver. My name is Diane Mercer. I'm calling from the State Education Board's Community Development Initiative. We've received your proposal for the Youth Leadership Program, and we're very interested in discussing implementation details." I sat up straighter. "That's wonderful news." "We were particularly impressed by the emphasis on mentorship and practical skill development," she continued. "This aligns perfectly with our goals for underserved areas." As she outlined next steps, I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with the Reeves name or foundation. This was a project I had developed independently, drawing on years of direct experience with the community's needs. When the call ended, I looked around my small apartment, the same space Eleanor had refused to live in. I'd been thinking about moving now that finances were no longer a constraint. But sitting there with the acceptance letter for my program proposal in hand, I realized this place had served its purpose well. It had sheltered me through the hardest years of supporting Eleanor, through the depression that followed, and now through the rebirth of my sense of purpose. I was ready for a new chapter, not defined by Eleanor's rejection or by my grandfather's legacy, but by my own choices and vision for the future. The next morning I arrived early at the community center. Taylor was already there, a stack of registration forms for our after-school program on his desk. "You're looking better," he observed. "More like yourself." I smiled. "I'm feeling more like myself. How's the program enrollment looking?" "Full, with a waiting list." He hesitated. "Listen, with this new partnership coming through, we'll need someone to oversee the expanded operations. Everyone's hoping it'll be you." The offer hung between us, a leadership position that would allow me to shape the program from the ground up. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Would you consider having lunch this week? There's someone from your grandfather's days I'd like you to meet." Two paths stretched before me, one leading toward the family legacy I was just beginning to understand, the other toward the work I'd built with my own hands. For the first time, I realized I didn't have to choose between them. "I'd love to take on the role," I told Taylor, "but I have a few ideas on how we might expand even further." 6 months had passed since Thanksgiving night. Spring had given way to summer, bringing with it a sense of renewal that matched my own internal transformation. The Youth Leadership Academy, my expanded program, was thriving, with over 100 students from the city's most underserved neighborhoods now receiving mentorship, academic support, and career guidance. I stood at the back of the community center's main hall, watching as the first cohort of students presented their community improvement projects to an audience of parents, teachers, and local officials. 15-year-old Marcus was explaining his team's plan to convert an abandoned lot into a neighborhood garden, his voice growing more confident with each slide. "We'll need volunteers for the initial clearing," he said, gesturing to his meticulously prepared budget. "But once established, the garden will be self-sustaining through our seed-saving program and community involvement." Pride filled my chest. 6 months ago, Marcus had been on the verge of dropping out, convinced that education had nothing to offer someone from his neighborhood. Now he was presenting a business plan he'd developed himself, with practical solutions to food insecurity in his community. As the presentation concluded to enthusiastic applause, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Richard Caldwell stood beside me, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him in his casual shirt and slacks. "That young man has quite a future ahead of him," he said, nodding toward Marcus. "They all do," I replied. "They just needed someone to recognize their potential." Richard smiled. like Thomas did for me. He paused, watching as the next group of students took the stage. He would be proud of what you've built here, Oliver. It honors his legacy while creating something entirely your own. Working with Richard over the past months had been unexpected but rewarding. Free from Eleanor's shadow and Judith's judgment, we'd developed a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. He'd become a valuable advisor for both the foundation work and the academy, offering guidance without trying to control the direction. As we moved to the refreshment table, I spotted a familiar figure across the room. Eleanor stood near the entrance, uncertain in a way I'd never seen her before. Our paths had crossed occasionally in recent months, professional events, community functions, but always with careful distance maintained on both sides. Richard followed my gaze. "She came on her own," he said quietly. "Said she wanted to see your program in action." I nodded, not quite sure how I felt about her presence. The sharp pain of her betrayal had dulled, replaced by something more complex. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition that what had broken between us had been flawed from the start. "I'll leave you to it," Richard said, squeezing my shoulder before walking away. Eleanor approached slowly, her confidence returning with each step. "This is impressive," she said, gesturing to the hall filled with engaged students and supportive community members. "The county hospital has seen a difference in teen health outcomes already since your program started." "That's good to hear," I replied. "We're focusing on whole-person development, academic, physical, and emotional well-being." She nodded. "It shows." She hesitated, then added, "I'm presenting a proposal next week to partner with community organizations for preventative healthcare education. Your academy would be an ideal collaborator." The offer was professional, without emotional manipulation or hidden agenda. "Send me the details," I said. "If it benefits our students, we're interested." A small smile crossed her face. "I will." As she turned to leave, I felt compelled to ask, "How are you, Eleanor?" "Really?" She paused, considering the question carefully. "I'm better. The work at the county hospital is challenging but fulfilling. I'm learning to define success on my own terms." She met my eyes directly. "You taught me that even if I didn't want to learn it at the time." With a small nod, she continued toward the exit, stopping briefly to congratulate Marcus on his presentation. Watching her, I realized we had both found our separate paths to authenticity. The hurt she'd caused would always be part of our shared history, but it no longer defined my present or my future. "Mr. Reeves," Lucia, one of our youngest participants, appeared at my side. "Can you help us set up for the next presentation? The projector's acting weird again." "Of course," I said, following her to the tech table where several students were huddled around the equipment. As I helped them troubleshoot the connection, Maggie arrived with her fiancé, waving excitedly from across the room. She had moved closer 3 months ago, taking a teaching position at a local school that partnered with our academy. Having her nearby had been an unexpected blessing, strengthening our already close relationship. The evening continued successfully, with project after project showcasing the creativity and determination of students who had previously been overlooked by traditional educational systems. When the final presentation concluded, the mayor approached me, impressed by what she'd seen. "The city council is looking to expand youth programs in 3 additional neighborhoods," she said. "We'd like to discuss using your academy as a model." By the time the last student left, night had fallen. I stood in the empty hall, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The devastating Thanksgiving dinner that had seemed like an ending had actually been the beginning of something far more meaningful than I could have imagined. The next morning, I met with Ms. Winters at the foundation offices to review quarterly activities. As we finished our discussion, she handed me a small book bound in worn leather. "This belonged to your grandfather," she said. "I thought you might want to have it now." It was a journal, its pages filled with Thomas Reeves's thoughts on purpose, community, and legacy. One passage in particular caught my eye. "True wealth isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you give away. Not just money, but time, knowledge, opportunity. Success isn't about recognition. It's about impact that continues after you're gone." I closed the journal, feeling a deep connection to a man I'd known only briefly as a child, but whose values had somehow shaped my own, even in his absence. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where my grandparents and father were buried. I hadn't visited since before Thanksgiving, too consumed by survival and then rebuilding to make the trip. Standing before their headstones, simple markers that gave no hint of the Reeves legacy, I felt a profound sense of continuity. My grandfather had built a business empire only to redirect its fruits toward community service. My father had chosen teaching over wealth, touching countless young lives through his work. And now I was continuing that legacy in my own way, combining the resources of one with the direct impact of the other. Dead weight, Eleanor had called me that night, seeing only what I lacked by her narrow definition of success. How different things looked from where I stood now, rooted in purpose, surrounded by meaningful work and genuine relationships. As I placed flowers on each grave, my phone buzzed with a text from Taylor. Donor meeting confirmed for Thursday. They're excited about the expansion plans. I smiled, sliding the phone back into my pocket. With the Foundation's resources and my first-hand understanding of community needs, the Academy was positioned to grow beyond what either I or my grandfather could have achieved alone. The quiet satisfaction I felt wasn't about proving Eleanor wrong or impressing her family. It wasn't even about the Reeves name or the doors it had opened. It was simpler than that. The deep contentment of living in alignment with my true values, of making a tangible difference in lives that society too often overlooked. Walking back to my car, I thought about the students I'd watched present their projects, Marco, who had overcome homelessness, Lucia supporting her siblings while maintaining straight A's, Marcus transforming his anger into community advocacy. Their resilience and determination inspired me daily. That was the real legacy worth preserving, not wealth or status, but the commitment to recognizing potential in unexpected places and creating opportunities for it to flourish. In the end, it wasn't about being a Reeves or proving my worth to the Caldwells. It was about continuing a tradition of quiet impact that rippled outward in ways that couldn't be measured but would be felt for generations to come. And in that realization, I found something far more valuable than the approval I'd once desperately sought. I found peace.